Hey guys, tonight we slip into the dusky streets of Paris, the sky bruised purple like an overripe plum, and you trudge along cobblestones slick with evening mist. The gas lamps flicker, casting quivering halos that dance over mossy walls, and every echo of your footsteps feels like a heartbeat in a city holding its breath. You probably won't survive this without cringing at one point, but fear not, I'll be your sleepy tour guide through the ranks of the dead. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments so I know who's joining from halfway across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You round a corner into the place Joachim de Ballet, where lantern light spills onto empty benches. Somewhere nearby, a carriage rattles past, wheels thudding like distant tomb drums. Beneath your feet, you sense layers of history, medieval streets paved over Roman roads, and at your side, the bones of centuries of Parisians waiting for their final rest. The city you know as romantic and chic is tonight a labyrinth of whispers and subterranean secrets. Historians still argue whether the choice to bury within city limits began as a pious practice or a miserly one imposed by church funds. Straight ahead, the towering facades of houses crowd the horizon, so tightly you feel penned in. Above, shutters clack in the breeze. Once they sheltered lit candles for night prayers, now they guard windows from curious eyes. You inhale and taste the night. A faint tang of wood smoke from bakeries stoking ovens for tomorrow's baguettes, overlaid with something muskier, a hothouse scent of damp earth and decay. That close mingling of perfume and rot was routine in the 18th century, when Paris recorded more than 30 cemeteries within its walls, each overflowing like reunion parties that nobody RSVP'd for. As you walk, a stray cat darts between your ankles, its eyes reflective gold like tiny lanterns. You imagine it has seen more midnight burials than an undertaker. In fact, by 1780, the largest Parisian cemetery, Les Innocents, had accumulated roughly 2 million bodies over 600 years of use, stacked in shallow pits, then exhumed and reburied, and then dug up again. It's a bit like stale croissants passed from hand to hand, until nobody remembers who baked them except much, much grosser. A concealed alley to your right tempts you, its entrance draped in ivy and shadow, and you duck inside. The air turns cooler, but thicker, like damp blankets piled on top of you. You strain to hear anything besides the drip of water from a cracked pipe overhead. Closer still, you spot moss-carved skulls peeking from niches high on the walls, quirky little reminders that skeletons made occasional cameos even in architecture. Medieval builders sometimes inserted sculpted bones into their walls, ostensibly to ward off evil, though some argue it was just a neat Gothic flourish. You press onward, navigating narrow corridors where every stone seems soaked in whispered confessions. Flickering torchlight reveals graffiti scratched into limestone, initials and dates, love notes from mourners, and the occasional crude pun, because even in death's shadow someone had to crack a joke about their last grave mistake. One scrawl reads, "I'd rather be alive and poor," which frankly has become a motto for modern apartment hunting. Soon, you emerge onto a wider street, the fumes momentarily lifted by a breeze. A bobbing lantern in the distance marks the entrance to the Charnel pit, the infamous Ossuaire de la Ville. Here, the bones of the dead were supposed to rest after relocation from overcrowded churchyards. But just like every simple solution in history, it only grew more elaborate by moonlight. Wagons piled high with skulls would rattle into hidden tunnels, while overseers counted heads as if tallying livestock. Your footsteps carry you past shuttered shops, the baker who still kneads dough in pre-dawn hours, the apothecary whose bottles of rosewater promise to disguise the stench of decomposition. Even then, folks believed a spritz of scented water could stave off the miasma, the invisible poison they thought rose from rotting flesh. It took until 1866 for Pasteur's germ theory to dispel that theory. But until then, Parisians clung to the hope that a little lavender oil in their handkerchiefs would keep the Black Death at bay. You pause at an iron gate, its bars rusted into twisted shapes like arthritic fingers. Beyond, rainwater has pooled in indentations, forming mirror-like puddles, reflecting lantern flames overhead. Every drop of water adds to the chorus of night sounds. Distant murmurs, a dog barking across the Seine, the slow drip, drip, drip that follows you like a heartbeat. You lean closer and catch a flash of white, tiny bones submerged under murky water, like an archaeological soup. A curious thrill ripples through you. Paris, the city of light, harbors this underworld that thrums with solemn purpose. And though the boulevard above hums with chatter and carriage wheels, down here you grasp how precarious the boundary is between the living and the dead. One misstep, and you'd tumble into history's waiting arms. Yet here you are, tiptoeing through crypts that were never meant for public tours, and you half expect to meet a skeleton guide, offering you a lantern made of femur. You shake your head, remembering an old joke about Parisians being die-hard fans of their cemeteries. 3 cheers for morbid humor, because if you can't laugh at it, you might just weep, or worse, inhale too deeply and join the skeleton choir. You glance back at the winding passage you've just left, feeling both relieved and oddly nostalgic for that suffocating hush. Now you continue onward, ears alert for the next chapter in this nocturnal odyssey. Somewhere ahead, the church bells mark midnight, but your watch reads only a few strikes, because time bends here, and the nights can feel as endless as the stacks of coffins lining these walls. The journey has just begun, and already you sense the layers of Paris unfolding like an onion, each peel revealing a deeper layer of bones, secrets, and a city's desperate attempts to manage its dead. You step off the main thoroughfare and find yourself on the narrow Rue aux Fèves, lantern in hand, your breath curling into the chill air. The cobblestones here feel uneven, as though someone unceremoniously dumped a handful of bones beneath them and pressed them into the earth. Ahead looms the arched entrance of Les Innocents Cemetery, once a verdant churchyard, now a cavernous pit crammed with layers of human remains. Lantern light spills across weathered tombstones carved with cherubs and skulls, their hollow eyes seeming to follow your every move. You probably won't notice at first, but the ground here has settled unevenly over centuries as bodies compressed and gave way like soggy peat. You trudge down a gentle slope, the path narrowing until you find yourself between towering walls of earth. On one side, a half-buried crypt reveals limbs tangled like discarded twigs. On the other, mounds of jade-hued moss cling to stones flecked with powdered bone. This wasn't always a mass deposit. It started in the Middle Ages as a respectful parish cemetery, a place for bell ringers, bakers, and barmaids to rest. By the 1780s, though, Les Innocents had become the city's main dumping ground, absorbing the overflow from half a dozen smaller churchyards. Historians still argue whether the original parish priests quietly encouraged extra burials to boost tithes, or whether they simply surrendered to the crushing demand of Paris's growing population. As you walk, you notice that some skulls show small drill holes. Turns out, during the Renaissance, medical students occasionally bribed gravediggers for intact heads to practice trepanation, that fringe little procedure of boring holes in skulls to relieve pressure or expel evil spirits. No warranty included, obviously. You pause by a mound where the bones coil in a loose spiral, vertebrae stacked like the spindle of an old loom. Someone, most likely a bored sexton, inscribed "Tangling in Death" on a nearby stone, a quirky epitaph that survived the centuries. The air here is surprisingly cool, as if the earth itself is breathing out a sigh, but it carries a stale note of damp earth and dried flesh. You press a hand to the wall of bones. It's slick with condensation and somehow warm, as though exhaling centuries of body heat. Beneath your fingers you feel the rough edges of shattered femurs and the smooth curve of pelvis bones, worn soft by shifting soil. In the flickering glow you spot a small pile of mouse bones, likely dragged here by scavengers long ago in a pinch for protein. Yes, grave mice were a thing. Locals sometimes blamed them for stealing scraps of linen from burial shrouds. You continue deeper, the mound walls rising to shoulder height. Above your head, wooden beams support the earthen ceiling, makeshift scaffolding installed in 1765 after a partial collapse nearly crushed a gravedigger's wheelbarrow. One collapses every few years, and parish records tally the accidents, though clerks charmingly euphemize them as earthly reorganizations. By then the cemetery was so overcrowded that mass graves were being reopened and older remains shifted to make room for fresh corpses every 2 weeks. A hush falls as you reach the central pit. Gaping shafts where new burials were once lowered, now empty hollows shaped like inverted cones. This was the renewal practice: exhume, rebury, and repeat. It was economical, but horrified reformers who described the process as the macabre conveyor belt of eternity. Some corpses, if they had chunky soil or thick clay around them, remained relatively intact, their shrouds clinging like draped gowns. You step carefully around a cluster of rib cages, petrified into geological strata that could fool anyone into thinking it was a curious rock formation. Up ahead, a stone alcove houses two modest tombs of nobility, unmarked except for an uneasy sense of privilege. Against all logic, the bodies of well-born Parisians sometimes spent half their lives in secure vaults, untouched, while the humblest baker or beggar got reduced to bone fragments within weeks. That inequality in death was as stark as any in life, and it fueled heated debate among social critics of the era. Historians still argue whether such disparities contributed significantly to public outrage, and eventually to calls for radical cemetery reform. You glance back at the entrance and catch sight of an oculus of moonlight glimmering through a gap in the wall. It feels like an eye watching you, perhaps the ancestral gaze of every soul ever buried here. In the one light, the bones stack 15 feet high, and you realize this is vertical burial writ large, a human Jenga puzzle precariously piled for centuries. You can almost hear the sighs of ground settling, an inaudible shifting that could trigger a collapse at any moment. Leaning against a limestone marker, you recall reading that by 1780, the graveyard had seen an estimated 2.5 million intimates, equivalent to nearly half of Paris's living population at the time. That statistic alone curls your spine, but you smile inwardly at yourself for housing that fact so tidily. Amid the silence, a rat scuttles across a skull, pausing to pause on a canine tooth like it's inspecting a shiny button. Historians still argue whether such vermin significantly accelerated decomposition, or simply redistributed the bones in more artistic arrangements. Ahead, the path curves upward. You climb a few stone steps hewn from the cemetery wall, resurfacing onto Rue des Halles, where the night market carries on as if the graveyard behind you were mere backdrop. Lantern-lit stalls display cheese wheels and roasted chestnuts. Vendors shout prices that clash with the hush you just left. You inhale that familiar blend of fresh bread, spiced cider, and horsehair from wagon harnesses. Above it all drifts the faintest echo of hollow clacking from the ossuary, reminding you that beneath every lively scene lies the scaffold of the dead. You pause at the corner cafe, its windows steamed with heat from simmering broth. In a wild juxtaposition, a mother soothes her teething child inside, humming a lullaby that about-face knocks your heart sideways. You imagine the mothers of strange centuries past, perhaps strolling here in petticoats, contemplating their own mortality as they smell decay rising from the walls. In that moment you feel tethered across time. Your footsteps echo theirs, and your curiosity unites you with every corpse stacked just yards away. Turning away, you carry that perspective into the next street, where modernity and mortality collide once more. As you leave Les Innocents behind, you can't help but call back to that chalk-scribed epitaph. I'd rather be alive and poor, and recognize that even amid death's silent verdict, life's petty complaints endure. And though you've glimpsed the underbelly of Paris's deadliest secret, you press on, heart fluttering with both relief and an odd yearning for the hush of the bone walls. You step into a sweltering June evening, and the very air seems to thicken around you like honey left out in the sun. Each inhalation is a commitment. You draw in the warm breeze, spiced with faint traces of horse manure from the market stalls, then wince as a sharper note slashes through the sweet sour tang of rot. Behind closed shutters, chamber pots haven't been emptied in hours. Above, the gutters groan under the weight of summer rains, pooling sludge in every street corner. You probably won't notice the first time you inhale, but this is no gentle countryside bouquet. It's a potent cocktail of decay and humidity that clings to your lungs. As you trudge past wooden barrels leaking onto the curb, you recall that in 1745 a blistering summer saw temperatures spike above 30 degrees C for weeks, enough to turn the walls of stone into ovens and accelerate decomposition in churchyards, until the stench drove residents to the brink. It was so intense that vendors set up perfume tents in Les Halles, selling rosewater sachets and lavender-wrapped handkerchiefs by the handful. Historians still argue whether those flower oils truly masked the miasma, or if people simply pretended they did to feel classy in the heat. You lift a fold of your linen handkerchief, embroidered, because you're a modern listener with fine taste, and press it over your nose. A little chic, a little foolish, but you notice the damp cloth turns a muddy yellow within minutes. Almost immediately, sweat trickles down your back, collecting at the small of your waist like a miniature reservoir. You pat your forehead, and send a silent apology to every Parisians who trudged these streets centuries ago, without cotton wick to soak up the misery. A rat scuttles across your path, tail flicking like a metronome, counting off the seconds until your next gulp of air. Once, locals blamed these rodents for spreading the plague, but by 1760 they at least understood that fleas, not rats themselves, carried the disease. Fringe herbalists hawked flea-repellent garlic necklaces to terrified families, insisting that wearing a headband of crushed garlic cloves could save you from infection, though most children ended up smelling like a vampire's marinade. You grin at the image of aristocrats strolling Versailles, garlic bulbs bouncing against powdered wigs. The smell intensifies as you approach a blocked-off alley, where piles of refuse from nearby taverns and tanneries ferment in the heat. Sludge bubbles in wooden casks, releasing a sharp ammonia hiss that makes you wince. Someone long ago carved the words "Bienvenue à la mort" into a leaning signpost, "Welcome to death," in what must have been a dark humor attempt at tourism. You can practically hear the guidebooks now. Be sure to note the color of your shoes, you'll never unsee it. A joke, yes, but you stifle a shiver at the thought of crumbly shoes dissolving in composting entrails. Still, there's beauty in this steaming mire. Tiny dreamcatcher-like spiderwebs stretch between barrels, shiny threads glistening with dew, and fireflies, if you look closely, blink in and out above a stagnant puddle. It's as if nature stages a late-night surprise party here. Hanging fairy lights over the banquet hall of decay, you crouch to examine a cluster of toadstools that glow faintly under your lantern beam. Rumor holds that nickelwood mushrooms sprout only on freshly turned soil, and feast on the proteins in decomposing flesh. Gourmet chefs never ventured this far, though some adventurous eaters in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine reportedly sampled them at their own risk. Ahead, a street lamp gutter drips into a cobblestone crevice, sending ripples through a shallow pool of brackish water. In the reflection, the underside of a carriage looks like a galloping skeleton, wheels dressed in rags. You can't help but stomp around the puddle. No point in being artistic when there's a risk of pathogens. And you remind yourself that modern Parisians paved these stones in the 19th century, precisely to drain away the worst floods of filth. Yet even that couldn't fully erase centuries of septic runoff and mortuary overflow. Your tongue tastes metal as you swallow, and you realize the miasma isn't just olfactory, it's in your throat. A slimy film that clings until you sip vinegar and water, the humble panacea of 18th century apothecaries. Remember that quaint vinegar drink from section 1? Yep, same trick. They called it Posca after Roman legionaries who swore by it, assuming it kept the airborne evil at bay. And honestly, you'd try anything at this point: cork bracelets, powdered unicorn horn, or a persistent chant of Parisian lullabies. Despite the gross-out factor, you can't escape the feeling that this poisonous ballet has a rhythm of its own. The stench pulses in time with your heartbeat, and you find yourself breathing in on a count of 4, holding, then releasing, almost like a meditation exercise to stay calm amid chaos. You imagine a 21st century ASMR influencer recommending stench therapy as a radical wellness trend, complete with a soothing voiceover. Now inhale that burnt sugar aroma mixed with subtle undertones of composting peasants. You snort a laugh, echoing in the empty street. A stray dog emerges, nosing through trash heaps, its fur matted. It pauses beside you, head tilted as if it knows better than to smell too deeply. You pat its shoulder. It wags an undernourished tail. Someone once claimed dogs could detect plague-infected corpses by scent alone, but skeptics scoffed at that four-legged sniffer theory. Historians still argue whether such anecdotes are genuine observations or just fanciful tales penned by bored gravediggers. Either way, you appreciate the canine company, even if it's here strictly for opportunistic feasting. You trudge onward, passing a plastered notice warning of unhealthy vapors seeping from St. Lawrence Charnel yard. Below it, someone scribbled a mocking reply, "Buy your own rosewater, monsieur." You laugh and tuck the notice into your pocket. Collector's item. The notice reminds you that church authorities repeatedly issued edicts forbidding burials so close to residential quarters. But with Paris growing faster than anyone planned, the decrees were often shrugged off, nailed to walls, then ignored like parking tickets. Soon the breeze shifts, and for a fleeting moment, you taste something fresh. Maybe the river's lullaby drifting across the left bank. It's as though the scene and its slow current reach out, Pulling away a layer of rancid atmosphere, you pause and inhale deeply. Hints of wet stone, chalky catfish, and picnic bread drying in a gentle current. Your lungs sigh in relief. But then the whiff of decay creeps back in, reminding you that the subterranean burial pits still bubble beneath the city's foundations, pressing their stench upward like anxious ghosts wanting their share of attention. You glance back toward the alley that led you here, recalling the echoing hush where bone walls held their own chorus. That memory steadies you after all. You've survived deeper horrors in Section 2's bone spiral, and you'll handle this sweaty challenge just fine. Besides, once the catacombs open beyond, the air turns crisp. Like a wine cellar, dusty but breathable. You press on, feet dragging through morning-blown straw and yesterday's market leftovers, mindful of each step as if walking a tightrope between life's sweet breath and death's rancid exhale. Up ahead, a second notice catches your eye. Announcement of a royal commission to relocate churchyard remains to below-ground quarries, ostensibly to reclaim surface space and banish that toxic smell for good. You almost cheer inhaling relief is underrated, but you remind yourself that it took decades to plan and execute. Change in monarchies is often slower than a funeral procession, and yet you sense progress on the horizon, even as this night's journey still holds one more layer of Paris to uncover. You emerge onto Rue de la Ferronnerie, where the clatter of market life ricochets off stone facades and the aroma of freshly baked bread beckons like a siren's call. Stalls bristle with crusty loaves, pain de campagne, brioche swirls and rye batons that crack under your fingertips. You probably won't notice the charred aroma faintly licking your senses, but it mingles with something more sinister, the ever-present whiff of decomposing bone drifting up from a yawning pit just beyond the vendor's awning. Here commerce and corpses collide in a dance, as old as urban sprawl. On your left, the stall displays jars of quince jelly and bowls of fruit, so glossy they seem to glow under the morning sun. On your right, the crumbling wall of Les Innocents ossuary gapes like a toothless mouth, its low arch framing skeletons piled high in neat rows, their hollow eye sockets gazing indifferently at passing shoppers. Historians still argue whether the proximity of markets to cemeteries was intentional, an early form of urban zoning, or simply a case of reverse real estate gravity, where the living valued convenience over olfactory comfort. You step closer to a baker hunkered behind a wooden crate. He's a barrel-chested fellow with flour-dusted sleeves rolled up to his elbows. You raise a crusty bouillie to his nose and inhale deeply. Warm wheat, a whisper of smoke, and a faint metallic tinge that hints at the nearby bone dust. How much for this beauty? You ask, lifting an eyebrow in mock solemnity. He grins, revealing a missing front tooth, perhaps lost in a particularly enthusiastic bit of baguette chewing. 2 sous, he replies, voice gravelly like overbaked crust. You counter with a sou and a promise to tell his wife you said hello, an offer he accepts with a hearty chuckle. As you hand over the coin, you glance at the ossuary wall. A lone skull rests atop a tidy stack of femurs, as if attempting to survey the marketplace below. Someone has tied a ribbon around its seismatic arch, a quirky gesture of humanizing the inhuman, like dressing up a mannequin in a thrift store scarf. The effect is jarring and oddly affectionate. You pause, thinking about how those bones once belonged to real people, carpenters, seamstresses, children, and now serve as both silent testament and local landmark. You tear into the bread, the crust shattering like brittle plaster, and taste the warm, yeasty crumb. It's comforting, almost magical, given the surroundings. You bite again, and a soft crumb flutters from your lips, landing on a scattering of ash-like dust. A passing pigeon pecks at it, bobbing its head with delicate precision. In medieval times, pigeons roamed these streets in such numbers they were considered a form of living pest control, reducing refuse, but also leaving generous droppings atop tombstones. Fringe markets once sold pigeon stew to starving Parisians, garnished with foraged herbs. You shudder at the thought, then nibble another bite of bread to restore equilibrium. Nearby, a vendor hawks leather pouches filled with burnt rosemary and thyme. Keeps the vapors away, he whispers conspiratorially, his eyes darting toward the cemetery. Apothecaries of the day dispensed such sachets, convinced that aromatic herbs would neutralize the invisible miasma, thought to emanate from decay. Historians still argue whether these herbal fetishes offered any real protection, or simply lulled purchasers into a false sense of security. Either way, the ritual of clutching a fragrant pouch became so fashionable that even well-to-do ladies clipped them to their belts as early jewelry pieces. You wandered deeper into the market, passing stalls draped with dried fish and salted pork. A butcher carves hams by the wheelbarrowful, his apron splattered with brine. You lean in, inhaling the tang of curing salts, and catch sight of a carved wooden sign swinging overhead. Fresh meat, no rats inside. You crack a smile because if there's one thing more comforting than scented herbs, it's the promise of rat-free charcuterie. Yet as you glance toward the cemetery gate, you spot a rat whisking across the bone-strewn ground. The signwriter likely meant carrion rats, but here all rodents seem equally opportunistic. From a sellsword of a spice merchant, you procure a pinch of ambergris, whale vomit, so prized it fetched its weight in gold. You sprinkle a speck on your palm, close your eyes and inhale. It's warm, oceanic, with a hint of stale musk that somehow smells luxurious. Fringe perfumers blended it into eau royale, claiming it could fend off plague, or at least distract from the worst stenches of an underfunded city. Supreme irony, a substance born from marine biology, powering high society vanity, right next to a mass grave that fed the poorest of Paris. You drift toward a fountain at the market's center, a small basin where water trickles over mossy stone. Locals scoop ladles to wash hands, sticky from cheese samples. You watch droplets patter into the basin, murmuring like a lullaby in your ear. Undercurrents of that fountain once carried secret messages between midnight smugglers and revolutionary pamphleteers. Some whispered the ossuary walls echoed their calls, amplifying murmurs of dissent. Historians still argue whether such echoes inspired clandestine meetings, or simply freaked out pigeons roosting atop the rubble. Your elbow nudges a wooden barrel brimming with sardines in oil. You lift a fish, slick, iridescent, and imagine how its shimmering scales might glint under a lantern. Suddenly, your foot slips on a slick patch, a mixture of oil, rainwater, and who knows what else. You flail, knocking over a crate of apples that spill like bouncing skulls. A peal of laughter rises from nearby children, their giggles bright as bells against the low groan of the cemetery beyond. Three's a crowd, they say, but today that crowd includes living Parisians, dead ancestors, and curious visitors like you. A baker's apprentice taps you on the shoulder with a flowery grin. Try the cheese, she insists, holding out a wedge of camembert so runny it drips like candle wax. You nibble, and the tang explodes on your tongue. Earthy, pungent, nearly illicit. It's said that in 1786, a similar cheese was smuggled into noble dinners to scandalize guests from the provinces. Fringe gossip claimed it was made with unpasteurized milk from goats that grazed in cemeteries at twilight. You spit out a shard of crust and shake your head, puzzled how something so odorous could be both delicacy and horror show. You finish your bread, cheese lingering between your teeth, and wander toward the market exit where shadows deepen. Lantern light flickers in grates set into the pavement, secret vents coaxing cemetery air up from tunnels below. You press your palm to one and feel a soft exhalation of cool, bone-scented breeze. It's a gentle reminder that every step forward is also an echo backward in time. As you leave the market's bustle behind, you glance back at the ossuary entrance, framed by the stalls now shuttered for the day. A lone flower rests in a crack of the wall, violet petals stark against aged limestone. Someone placed it there, a small act of tenderness amid commerce and decay. You tuck a loose crumb into your pocket, souvenir of this uncanny bazaar, and head down the empty lane. Footsteps fade into the hush, market cries replaced by the hollow sigh of the bone walls, reminding you that beyond every loaf of bread and every clink of coin, the dead maintain their silent vigil. You slip through a narrow gap in the market's shuttered stalls, and the world shifts. The lantern's glow stretches long fingers along damp stone, and you find yourself between two vast walls of packed earth. Here, the charnel walls rattle with their own breath, like the groaning hull of a ghost ship stuck underground. You probably won't hear the first creak, your ears attuned to the clatter of carriage wheels and market cries. But down here, every shift of soil or mouse scurry twangs like a funeral gong. The walls rise 20 feet on either side, built from centuries of practice rather than design. Picture this. For 600 years, Parisians stacked bodies in shallow pits, then exhumed skeletons when space ran out, repacking bones in tight, vertical columns. By the mid-1700s, These makeshift towers of femurs and skulls became so colossal that visitors likened them to the Great Pyramid in miniature. Except that pyramid sneezes, historians still argue whether medieval sextons intended the walls as practical storage or accidental art installations. Either way, you're walking past one of the earliest examples of upcycled architecture. You advance, your footsteps thumping against the packed earth floor. The scent here is muted, oddly less pungent than the street above, like a closet you never open. Officially, the walls were meant to be sealed behind a stone facade to keep prying noses at bay, but time and moisture conspired to peel away that veneer. Now bones press against weathered plaster, poking through cracks like grinning onlookers at a macabre parade. Your lantern beam catches a half-buried skull high above, its jawbone dislocated as though laughing at some private joke. You wonder what joke that might have been. Probably something dark about unpaid taxes, or a particularly sour cheese. Fringe superstition held that if the skull's grin seemed too wide, it meant the occupant had lived a wicked life. Locals sometimes whispered that those grinning skulls cursed passers-by with bad dreams. A handy local rumour for parents desperate to get children to bed on time. A sudden creak echoes from your left, like a giant hinge opening. You freeze, heart doing a tap dance against your ribs. It's just a slab of stone shifting under pressure. A routine bone burp, gravediggers called it, though euphemisms varied by region. In 1763, a partial collapse in this very corridor nearly buried a team of workers under tons of skeletal debris. They escaped with nothing more than broken tools and bruised egos. Historians still argue whether the collapse was due to poor engineering or a cataclysmic mole invasion. Because yes, moles apparently tunneled in under the walls, creating dangerous voids beneath the charnel shelves. Leaning your lantern against the wall, you peel back a stray root that's threaded through a skull's eye socket, reminding you that nature always finds a way. Tiny green shoots poke through bone gaps, springing to life on a nutrient cocktail of calcium and earth. It's oddly poetic. In Death's Warehouse, new life tickles its way upward. Fringe herbalists once harvested these tunnel sprouts, believing they carried the essence of mortality and rebirth. Mixed reviews on the tincture's taste, though. You continue deeper, the walls narrowing until you have to angle your shoulders. Above, makeshift wooden beams cradle heaps of bone, dark as first coffee grounds. A single nail head glints in your beam, part of the supports installed by parish carpenters in 1757 to shore up a sagging shelf. They recorded the expense in ledgers under cemetery comforts, though it's anyone's guess which was more comforting. Sturdy beams or scented sachets stuffed in every pocket. As you step over a jutting femur, you recall that in 1738, an undertaker named Pierre Valcourt petitioned the Crown for standardized ossuary practices, arguing that the haphazard piling threatened public safety. The Crown responded with a half-hearted ban and an edict mandating regular inspections, most of which officials ignored because paperwork under lantern light is dull work. Historians still argue whether Valcourt's proposal would have prevented later collapses or merely slowed the charnel wall's upward artistic creep. Suddenly a flock of bats erupts from a fissure above, fluttering past your lantern in a silent storm. You duck, nearly smacking your head on a rib cage. These insectivores have colonized the tunnels, feasting on mosquitoes that breed in the damp gloom. Locals joked that the bats served as nature's clean-up crew, though other voices whispered that the winged shadows were bad omens, portents that the cemetery's restless souls would soon rise for a midnight disco. You grin at the thought and adjust your lantern higher on the wall. Further in, the corridor opens to a vaulted chamber where walls of bone curve inward like the ribcage of a cathedral. You step onto a flagstone dais, and your lantern flickers across an altar-like platform built entirely of skulls, an eerie homage to pyramids of the New World, carved of stone and built by ancient hands. This bone dais was erected in 1770 by a parish sexton named Marguerite Leroy, an unusually daring woman who oversaw some of Paris's most macabre tasks. Fringe accounts credit her with sculpting the dais on a dare from local barmaids, who bet she couldn't make death beautiful. You place your palm on the altar's smooth cranium and feel a hollow resonance, like tapping a resonant wine goblet. A muffled hum drifts through the bones, perhaps the vibration of distant carts, or the wind sighing through city grates. It's oddly melodic, a lullaby sung by the dead. You recall that catacomb guides in later centuries would gather visitors in similar chambers, telling stories of heroism and heartbreak, while candlelight trembled across the ossuary walls. Historians still argue whether these bone chapels served genuine spiritual functions, or were simply tourist attractions for well-heeled thrill-seekers. Overhead, a single beam of moonlight filters through a small oculus in the ceiling, illuminating a spiral of thigh bones that seems to float in space. You tilt your head, entranced by the geometry, a human Fibonacci sequence woven from fossilized flesh. Scholars of the time whispered about sacred mathematics hidden in such arrangements, suggesting the builders tapped into divine proportions. Fringe theorists claimed the bones were laid to correspond with celestial constellations, though nobody's found a star map carved into these stones yet. You step off the dais and press your lantern against a nearby wall, revealing an inscription scratched into plaster. Visi mortui vivos docent. Let the dead teach the living. A Latin aphorism so cliched, it must have amused the gravediggers who scrawled it in their scarce downtime. You trace the carving with a dusty fingertip, feeling the centuries press against your skin. As you navigate back toward the entrance, the walls seem to lean inward, as if coaxing you to stay. You glance over your shoulder at that spiral of bones, their white curves gleaming like fossilized coral. A shiver runs along your spine, equal parts awe and relief. Outside, the street lamps will be waiting, their steady globes reminding you that the living world still pulses beyond these bone-dry corridors. You duck through the exit, the world of bustle and banter reclaiming your senses in an instant. The hum of conversation, the distant clip-clop of hooves, the heady aroma of fresh pastry, all strike you like a warm bath after a bracing swim. You pat your pocket where that yellowed market notice still rests, your token from the edge of mortality. As you step back under the lantern-lit street, you remember Marguerite Leroy's altar and wonder, amid all that creaking and compressing, perhaps there's an art to arranging the dead, and perhaps in a strange way, you're grateful for her handiwork. You slip into a side street where torchlight dances off slick cobblestones, the air still carrying a faint whiff of last night's bonfire from a nearby tavern. In the distance, Peru Gate's ornate stone pillars loom, their carved fleur-de-lis glinting like royal watchful eyes. You probably won't notice the first edict nailed to the wooden brace of a shutter, its parchment curled and yellowed, but here it is, an order from Louis XV himself, sternly forbidding burials within the city walls. It's the third decree in as many decades, and each one is ceremoniously proclaimed at Grand Châtelet, then promptly flouted by gravediggers and parish priests alike. Historians still argue whether these royal bans aimed more at public health or at protecting the king's image as benevolent protector of his subjects. You lean in, reading the elegant swoops of copperplate script. Let there be no interment in parish grounds within the precinct of the Infanta de Paris, under penalty of heavy fines and ecclesiastical censure. Yet the penalty clause sits limp like a deflated soufflé, rarely enforced and often ignored. Officials, robes rumpled, collars askew, would stamp these scrolls, then drift off to wine-soaked feasts, leaving local vicars to decide if revenue from burial fees outweighed a slap on the wrist from Versailles. Fringe pamphleteers of the era circulated satirical broadsides illustrating bishops tipping silver coins to gravediggers, captioned, "He who pays the piper buries the pauper." At your side, a draft picks up scraps of decrees from previous years, twirling them across the stones. You watch a group of parish constables squabble over whose turn it is to brush them away. Their lanterns catch on mutilated nails, embedded in the walls, remnants of earlier edicts that once hung here, now serving as impromptu spokes for stray cloaks and market lanterns. You press your palm to the rough wood, feeling its age lined with grooves from repeated firings of proclamations. Each groove is a history lesson etched in grain, good intentions carving deeper than actual compliance. Above you, church bells toll 6 o'clock, their clang resonating against stone facades. That chime was once the signal for the nocturnal quietus bell, rung to remind mourners of approaching curfew, and more practically, to warn any would-be grave robbers that midnight burials were imminent. You imagine a scruffy sexton hanging from a bell rope, sneezing into a kerchief as he counted strikes, blissfully unaware that his own churchyard just earned another fine from the Prévost's office. A passing carriage kicks up dust, and you catch sight of its driver shrugging at a broken sign, Interdiction de Sepulture. His powdered wig bounces like a startled rabbit, as though the sign carried some weight beyond Dick. The carriage wheels grind to a halt, and two cloaked figures slip out, an apothecary and a royal inspector, clicking boots together as they stroll toward a half-dug trench, spilling coffins. You duck behind a barrel, eavesdropping on their murmured conversation. The king's orders are clear, the inspector says, voice clipped. Yet here we are, loading 10 fresh intimates in one tomb. The apothecary snorts. And the people pay for scented gloves to mask that smell, monsieur. Who profits more, the church or your fine collector? Neither, the inspector grumbles, fingering a pouch of fines, collected last month. 9 livres and 3 deniers, stuffed in a velvet pouch, pocket change for palace accounts. Consider this a futile gesture of statecraft. You slip forward, heart pulsing, and scatter a handful of straw at their feet. The two whirl around, lantern beams converging on you. You raise your hands, offering your most innocent, just taking in the sights posture. The inspector narrows his eyes, scanning your face as though it bears the watermark of royal suspicion. A moment later he shrugs, a gesture you recognize as the same one that has kept these edicts dormant for years. Go on then, but mind you, the king watches. You nod gravely, backing away as they turn back to the coffin pile. You continue down the street, passing shuttered taverns and smell of mulled wine seeping through cracks. Above one sign, a rusted nail holds a garish caricature of an archbishop pointing at a cemetery gate. Captured, "No sin here, proceed," its fringe satire at its finest, likely penned by a radical pamphleteer hiding in a garret near Saint-Denis. You trace the paint's chipped edge, recalling that underground presses churned out such ephemera by the thousands, stoking public ire at both clergy and crown. Ahead, the stone facade of St. Eustache Church looms, its grand portico a reminder that nobles often enjoyed privileged subterranean burials beneath church floors, another loophole in royal decrees. While paupers squeezed into narrow trenches, the elite reclined in marble vaults with brass nameplates gleaming like funeral invitations. You remember a chronicler's note that Marie-Louise, Marquise de Fontaine, paid 300 livres for her vault, more than twice the annual income of a skilled carpenter. Historians still argue whether such disparity in death deepened class resentment that would later fuel revolutionary fervor. You skirt around the churchyard wall, pausing to watch gravediggers lower ornate coffins, carved with gilded cherubs. The woodworkers had decorated these boxes as if they were thrones, a final gesture of dignity for the well-born who could afford it. Fringe rumor holds that some nobles opted for secret compartments within their coffins, to smuggle jeweled rings, or even tiny trapdoors to escape should the earth breathe too hot. You suppress a laugh at the mental image of a stately count popping out of his coffin to beg an undertaker for better ventilation. A breeze stirs a torn edict plastered on the church wall, revealing a margin note scrawled by a rebellious sexton. Quand le roi dort, la terre parle. When the king sleeps, the earth speaks. You trace the words, feeling a tingle as if you're privy to conspiracy. That bit of graffiti likely survived crackdowns because officials had bigger chores, like enforcing price controls on candle wax or monitoring pigeon droppings on royal balconies. You tuck the scrap of paper into your coat pocket, a relic of defiance in the face of authority. Up ahead, you cross the Pont au Change, its arches framing glowing lanterns reflected in the Seine. Beneath your feet, the river murmurs a lullaby of commerce and secrets. Boats lumbering past, cargo low with wood and wine, lest the waters be weighed down by more somber freight. Locals joked that the river carried whispers of every coffin dumped into its depths, swearing it spread the deadly vapors far beyond city walls. Historians still argue whether epidemics like the 1737 typhus outbreak actually stemmed from contaminated water or from fleas drowning in muddied riverbanks. You pause at a lantern post, smoothing down your cloak to wipe away stray incense from a passing procession. A group of mourners processes toward a new cemetery outside the city gates. Le Butte Caves, one of the first garden cemeteries designed to keep the dead at arm's length. You watch them file past, their candles flickering in time with their measured steps, and you sense early triumph of royal policy as they choose safety over tradition. Yet even here, whispers persist of midnight burials in concealed plots, because humans love secrets almost as much as they fear death. You exhale, feeling the weight of royal edicts, public health, and human obstinacy pressing on your shoulders like a heavy mantle. This clash of crown and church, decree and defiance, is a theatre of bureaucratic comedy played out in bone and earth, and though the king's orders blazed with authority, The city's lifeblood pulsed with a different rhythm, one that embraced profit, tradition, and occasionally outright cheat. Stepping away from the lantern's glow, you continue into the night, eager for the next scene where doctors wheel in their glass vials and dangle perfumed gloves from trembling fingers. The edicts may be ignored, but the story marches on, and you're right there in its unruly wake. Lantern in hand and curiosity ablaze, you slip through a carved wooden gate into a moonlit yard where the graves lie half dug and horses stamp impatiently. Midnight has just chimed from a distant belfry, and you trudge across turf softened by twilight dew. Lantern light glimmers off iron shovels and fresh mounds of soil, and the hush is broken only by the low murmur of grave diggers, swapping jests about whose lantern oil smells the least like coffin varnish. You probably won't notice at first, but these nocturnal interments were routine. Burials after sundown skirted prying eyes, avoided daytime crowds, and eased pressure on mortuary workers who otherwise couldn't keep pace with Paris's death toll. Ahead, two men lower a heavy coffin into a freshly opened pit. One grips a thick rope, the other guides the polished oak box by its handles, and you can practically feel the tension in the rope fibers. Fringe records mention grave diggers staging rope-tugging contests for wagers on who could heave the heaviest load. You lean in. The coffin slips silently into place, thud muffled by a blanket thrown atop the earth. Historians still argue whether these midnight ceremonies actually reduced the city's odor problem, or simply postponed the stink until dawn. You edge closer to a cluster of lanterns around a cannonball-sized pile of lime powder. White dust coats every surface, from leather boots to lantern glass. Quicklime was the gravedigger's secret weapon to hasten decomposition and absorb foul liquids, though fringe tales claim some workers tossed in little coins or scraps of cloth to encourage restless spirits to exit the premises. You dab a fingertip into the powder, chalky, cold, and oddly invigorating, and imagine the legends of exhumed corpses squeaking like old doll limbs when spritzed with water. The air here is damp, but surprisingly fresh compared to the daytime market. You breathe in a blend of pasture, sweet horse sweat, hay-cocked straw, and that faint metallic trace of buried metals, nails, coffin handles, and jewelry forgotten by grieving relatives. One gravedigger sniffs the air and sighs, better than fish guts at Les Halles, any night of the week. You grin, recalling your stroll through the market's preserved fish section back in section. A hooded figure emerges from the shadows carrying a lantern and a sheaf of parchment. You realize it's the pit overseer, tallying names and burial fees in an iron-bound ledger. He scratches a quill across the page, ink blotting onto his glove. Mainstream records note that by the 1770s, parish officers required detailed registers for every interment, listing age, parish, and cause of death, a rudimentary public health measure that foreshadowed later civil registration systems. You peek over his shoulder. The script is cramped, the margins scrawled with shorthand notes like line delay 24H and coffin reuse. Nearby, a team shifts soil back into another freshly emptied trench. Their shoulders sag under centuries of tradition and back-breaking labor, but they hum a bawdy tune to lift their spirits. Un temps bien creusé, une bière bien méritée. You catch the refrain and hum along. It's strangely comforting, like a communal lullaby for the dead and the living alike. Fringe lore asserts that singing while digging protects against earthly curses, though nobody really knows who invented that superstition. Maybe a bored sexton with a flair for drama. You step closer to see a small child peering through the iron bars of the outer fence. Her eyes are wide in the lantern glow. She clutches a tattered doll that looks more skeleton than toy. Rumor held that street waifs sometimes surreptitiously followed the burials, hoping to capture scraps of linen or wood for fire kindling. Parents of the era warned children that death's dole came for those who lingered too long, though historians still argue whether such tales were cautionary or merely excuse-making for city officials who refused to install child-proof gates. A sudden gust stirs the lantern flames, casting bones in silhouette against the yard's far wall. You startle as the shadow undulates, momentarily mimicking a dancer in powdered wig and pannier. You laugh, recalling Section 2's bone spiral, but here the effect is more eerie, like a phantom cavalier performing a macabre minuet. You steady your lantern, its glow settling on the yard's far corner, where a makeshift shrine of wooden crosses stands vigil. Each cross is painted black, bearing a name and date in chalk. These are pauper graves, unnamed in parish books, yet marked by workers moved to offer anonymity some dignity. Fringe graffiti next to one reads, "Hope you like it here," with a winking skull doodle. You kneel to examine a name. Marie Dubois, died of consumption, aged 34. You brush chalk off her cross, imagining her last moments, coughing under feather pillows, praying for relief, unaware that her bones would end up mingled with the masses. Behind the crosses, a burly gravedigger sprinkles a handful of dirt over a small coffin. The thunk of wood meets earth, and he mumbles a brief prayer, not for her but for himself, in case a marrow-itch spirit decided to haunt the living. He glances your way, and you raise a polite nod. He grins, revealing a gold front tooth that glitters like a macabre trophy. "Late night shifts lonely," he says. "Company's nice." You nod back, glad for his camaraderie. The overseer calls out, "All clear," and you watch as men snap their lanterns shut and hoist shovels onto shoulders. The hush returns, but not quite the same. It's the absence of clink and murmur that feels unnatural. You turn to leave, but a low groan ripples through the ground. You freeze as a few loose shovelfuls slump, disturbing a buried coffin lid. Horror flickers in your chest, until you realize it's merely the earth settling under the moon's weight. A grave sigh, workers called it. Historians still argue whether these nocturnal rumbles encouraged final reforms or were simply chalked up to mischievous ghosts. A stone gargoyle high on the church wall seems to leer at you as you exit the yard. Its weathered visage has watched countless burials, rinsing down rainwater that stained its cheeks like eternal tears. You rub salt residue from your sleeve and glance back. The crossed graves, the darkened shapes of pines beyond, and that lone lantern light flickering at the edge of sight. Stepping onto the street, you're met with the distant echo of a church choir practicing matins, an otherworldly counterpoint to the midnight trenches you just left. Their voices float above tiled roofs, like a soft benediction, promising daylight and fresh coffee to come. You inhale deeply, savoring the harmony of human song after the yard's muted symphony of shovels and sighs. You press on toward a broad boulevard where carriages glint in moonlight and aristocrats stroll in powdered wigs oblivious to the grind below. The contrast warms you. Above, life's glittering veneer. Below, the grim machinery of death. You tuck back into your coat pocket the overseer's fine parchment scrap you pilfered earlier. It feels like a secret key, a token of your midnight initiation. As you step under a street lamp, you recall that rope-tugging wager from earlier, and smile at the thought of moonlit gambling in a graveyard. You shake your head. Only in Paris would such ingenuity flourish. Even amid nighttime urgency, lantern in hand, you drift onward, heart steady, ready for the next scene where perfumed doctors debate the cause of epidemics and ignite a clash of science and superstition. You slip into a narrow garden courtyard tucked behind a low stone wall, where clipped boxwood hedges give way to rows of ornate urns filled with lavender and rosemary. Lantern light dances off polished brass apothecary jars lining a marble-topped counter. You probably won't notice the first waft of lavender-scented vinegar, so potent it could knock an undertaker's hat off at 10 paces. But here, physicians and perfumers converge in a contest of invisible poisons and fragrant quackery. Historians still argue whether miasma theory or early contagion models held sway in late 18th century Paris. You approach a semicircle of men gathered around a trestle table, 3 robed physicians in dark velvet coats, their powdered wigs perching precariously, and 2 apothecaries in pinstriped smocks, noses peeking over collars. One doctor, stroking his chin, declares in a measured tone, "The stench rising from les innocents must be the true source of plague, and indeed every ailment under the sun." A scribbler feverishly notes his words on parchment, labelled de malaria fossilis, lending gravitas to the notion that corrupted air breeds disease. Across the table, an apothecary triumphantly brandishes a leather pouch embroidered with gold thread. "Permit me this posy," he urges, a blend of orris root, ambergris, and powdered unicorn horn, a fringe ingredient purported to absorb noxious vapors. He sprinkles a handful onto the table, where it smolders like a miniature volcano of floral dust. "One sniff," he promises prospective clients, "and you'll breathe with the clarity of Apollo's lyre." You suppress a laugh at the image of the god, clearing his sinuses with a rose-scented sachet. A second physician, draped in maroon velvet, shakes his head at the unicorn horn claim. "Preposterous," he intones. "Disease springs from seeping filth, not mythical creatures. He lifts a tipped flask containing bubbling aqua pura, demonstrating a crude distillation of rainwater passed through charcoal, a nod to emerging inoculation experiments. We must purify the blood, he postulates, not merely mask odors. Historians still argue whether these proto-sterilization efforts foreshadowed Pasteur's germ theory or lingered too long in archaic habits. You drift close, lantern in hand, inhaling that signature blend of herbs and chemicals. The air is cool, laced with spicy clove notes and an undercurrent of camphor so sharp it feels like a surgical scalpel sliding beneath your nostrils. 3 jars at the corner of the table bear labels in looping copperplate: Oil de Serpent, Coral Rouge, and Sang de Dragon. Fringe alchemists swore these exotic powders repelled invisible miasmatic particles, though one Parisian wag joked that dragon's blood was really just old Burgundy scraped from decanters after court banquets. A third physician, younger and more pragmatic, unfurls a printed pamphlet titled De Contagione et Peste. He argues that diseases leap from person to person via seeds of sickness carried in bodily fluids, an early nod to contagionists. He steps forward waving a quill. Observe how nuns nursing the sick fall ill in turn despite lavender in their masks. Ergo, air alone cannot account for transmission. His pamphlet includes crudely drawn diagrams of doctors wearing beaked masks, filled with fragrant loam, which, despite their ostentation, couldn't prevent infection. You recall Section 3's garlic necklace anecdote, another pungent attempt at protection. The first apothecary, tapping his pouch, scoffs at contagion theory. Your seeds of sickness are but fanciful talk, he retorts. Show me a sick seed under a microscope. Of course, no microscope existed for bacteria yet, so his challenge lands with dramatic flourish. As he speaks, a pale moonbeam slips through a latticed window, glinting off a crystal retort. It casts prismatic patterns across the tiled floor, like spectral spores drifting in a sunbeam. Nearby, a young apprentice fusses over a vat of rosewater distillate. He ladles it into small vials to sell for 6 livres the bottle, or 10 if you fancy the royal seal. You can't help wryly noting that for that price, you'd expect a direct dispatch from Versailles. He offers you a drop on your wrist. You oblige, and for a fleeting moment your skin smells of Versailles gardens in full bloom, until the lingering metallic tang of bone dust reminds you where you are. Above the debate, a banner hangs on the far wall, a crude engraving of a skeleton flanked by a doctor's staff and a perfumer's mortar. Beneath, the legend reads, "A good nose beats a bad prognosis." Fringe humour at its finest, and you stifle a grin. It's reminiscent of the Bienvenue à la mort sign you passed in Section 3, another instance of Parisians flirting with gallows humour to temper their anxieties. You recall that stray cat from Section 1 that prowled near Les Innocents. If it could choose, it might wear a sachet of parsley to mask the stench. One of the velvet-robed physicians claps his hands and summons a patient from the shadows, a ragged labourer coughing into a muslin handkerchief. The crowd parts as he props the man up against a wax-covered chair. The doctor lifts a glass stethoscope, an experimental instrument imported from London, and presses it to the man's back. He listens solemnly, then declares he suffers from pulmonary stagnation, not simply bad air. The apothecaries murmur that stagnation is merely a poetic term for miasma compounded. Historians still argue whether these early diagnostic tools offered genuine insight or were theatrical props to impress aristocratic crowds. A second courtesan patient arrives, swaying in a gown still powdered from the evening's promenade. She clutches her throat dramatically, lamenting that no perfumed sachet warded off her affliction. One apothecary rushes forward with an ornate smoking censer, instructing her to inhale vapors of benzoin resin and myrrh. The fumes rise in ghostly tendrils, and in the lantern's glow the smoke slithers like lazy serpents. Fringe legends claimed that this smoke inhalation could awaken latent humours and reset the body's internal balance, but you suspect it mostly induced sneezing fits. You back away, momentarily dizzy from too many conflicting theories and too much cloying rose scent. Outside, the night air feels positively crisp, like a long-forgotten secret unlocked by your exit. Yet as you step onto the street, you carry the echo of that debate in your mind, whether disease is carried on invisible winds or passed hand to hand. Part of you admires the earnest discourse, their quills scratching out treatises that would one day shape modern medicine. Another part of you aches for a robust lavender cotton ball to mask every stench that arises from these labyrinthine bone vaults. A woman in a brocade gown passes, clutching a small velvet box as if it were her heart. She glances at you and nods, as though you too participated in that midnight symposium. You nod back, recalling Section 6's royal edicts flapping ignored on wooden shutters. It's the same spirit, authority issuing grand pronouncements, only to find that human habit and profit margins march to a different drummer. You tuck your lantern under your arm and continue down the narrow lane, the scent of violet oil lingering in your hair. Ahead lies the next scene, a clash of crown and cleric at the parish's grazing lands, and you steel yourself for chilly dawn winds and more bureaucratic skirmishes. But for now, you pause at a mossy fountain, wet stones glistening like beads of sweat. You kneel to dip your fingers into the water and whisper a quiet thanks to whichever theory truly conquers disease, whether it's miasma, contagion, or perfumed unicorn horn. You muse that the real antidote might simply be human ingenuity and a good night's sleep. You round a corner into a quiet square lit only by a solitary lamp whose glow pools like honey on the cobblestones, and you find yourself before the ivy-clad wall of Saint-Étienne-du-Mont. To your left, parish records brim with entry after entry of hasty burials, the quaint script interrupted by smudged ink where tears or rain fell. You probably won't notice at first, but here the battle lines between clergy and crown crackle like static in the air. Priests clutch their ledgers of burial fees while magistrates tally fines from royal edicts flapping uselessly on nearby walls. Historians still argue whether this clash was a moral crusade over sacred ground or simply a numbers game to finance church coffers. A cluster of parish clerks stands beneath a carved niche of Saint Genevieve, her stone gaze unwavering. One clerk, quill tucked behind his ear, lectures a royal bailiff in a threadbare coat. The poor may sleep in pauper pits, but the dignified rest in consecrated earth, each at the agreed tariff. The bailiff, tapping his wand of office, counters quietly. Your tithes defy his majesty's decree. These grounds must close by month's end. Fringe pamphlets of the era depicted such exchanges as comedic farce. Illustrations showed bishops tossing coins into bottomless graves to feed an insatiable appetite for revenue. You edge closer to overhear the sum in dispute. 12 sous for a shrouded intimate, plus 2 for the bell toll, and another 3 if the grave lies within church walls. A whiff of incense drifts from a nearby confessional, mingling oddly with your lantern's cedar smoke perfume. It's said that some clergy soaked their robes in scented oils to disguise the odor of ledger pages damp with peat moss and decomposed petitions. In fact, one eccentric curate reputedly carried a pomander of crushed rose petals in his pocket, declaring it a bulwark against bureaucratic miasma. Nearby, a magistrate scribe unfurls a royal mandate stamped with the king's fleur-de-lis seal. Its pronouncements sparkle on the parchment. No further burials within city precincts, hefty fines for transgressors, and the immediate transfer of fees to the royal treasury. Yet parchment being parchment, it's riddled with eardrop holes, those telltale signs of being pinned, repinned, and perhaps even gnawed by mice seeking morsels of starch. Fringe scribblers joked that mice, though unbaptized, enjoyed the taste of royal decrees more than peasants did. You recall Section 6's royal edicts, shamelessly ignored outside Peru Gate, and now witness their flop here. The bailiff pauses to count coins clinking in a velvet pouch, his eyes flicking to the church gate where mourners linger. A widow in a black veil approaches, clutching a small purse. She kneels before the clerk who tallies her late husband's age, rank, and parish. Details required for church burial. The widow winces as he announces the fee, 15 s. The bailiff seethes, but the widow hands over the coins, prioritizing consecrated ground for her Samuel, even if it meant selling her only shawl. Historians still argue whether the poor embraced these pauper pits as solidarity or resented being fenced into earth. Unblessed by bells, a fringe ballad from the Faubourg Saint-Germain tells of a pauper king crowned with daisies, marching to his grave to mock both priest and prince. You hum a line under your breath. He wears no crown but his heart's rebuke. It's absurd and oddly comforting. A sudden clop of hooves snapped you back. A mounted constable rides past, his cloak swirling, lantern reflecting on polished breastplate. He carries a sealed writ commanding closure of all consecrated yards within city walls. Yet, minutes later, he'll gallop off to the next parish, only to find another priest swinging his own writ, absolving fees and whispering blessings. You sigh, recognizing this endless tug-of-war as the true unseen undertaker of Paris's burial chaos. At the church's side door you find a ledger chest bound in iron. Inside, pages list every transaction, names of nobles etched in gold leaf and those of paupers scribbled in charcoal. You flip to a page marked Temps de Réforme 1780, where an entry reads, Marguerite Rousseau, children 2 interred Saint-Secchio, paid 4 sous. The clerk who wrote it added a margin note, charity or profit. You trace the blotted ink, feeling the centuries-old question linger beneath your skin. Above you, a gargoyle perches on the church's cornice, stone wings curled as if eager to flee. You imagine it eavesdropping on every fee dispute, fed up and ready to spit water rather than rain any more decrees. In folklore, gargoyles were once thought to ward off evil spirits. Perhaps they also guarded bored clerks from the drudgery of tallying. Yet another burial. You step back into the square, the hush broken by a distant bassoon practicing in a courtyard. The note cracks like a tomb's lament, yet somehow brightens the gloom. You recall the bone choir murmured about in section 1, but here the melody is defiantly alive. Proof that culture marches on, undeterred by squabbles over soil and statutes. Turning down a side lane you pass the magistrate's temporary booth, an awning propped on barrels where fines are accepted every Tuesday. A handwritten sign advertises quick absolution, fines waived for donations to the poor box. It's a cheeky workaround that channels church funds into royal coffers, blurring lines between crown and cloth. Fringe economists of the time speculated that the poor box was the wealthiest charity in Paris, owing to its unexpected monopoly on divine forgiveness. You pause at a grated vent in the pavement. From below you catch the faintest echo of chanting, perhaps a mass from the hidden ossuary below, where bones await reinterment. It reminds you that no matter how loud the lawyers and priests argue, the dead remain mute, yet omnipresent arbiters of the city's conscience. Finally, you emerge onto a bustling boulevard where carriages glide past in mere silence, passengers, oblivious to the ecclesiastical audits you just witnessed. You press a hand to your chest, sensing the echo of every coin counted, every decree dismissed. The tug-of-war between parish and palace has shaped these streets as much as any set of stones or stack of bones. You tuck the margin note from Marguerite Rousseau's ledger into your coat pocket, a small artifact of clerical descent. It feels fanciful, yet crucial, like a key to understanding how faith, finance, and flesh entwined in 18th century Paris. Lantern in hand, you continue onward, anticipating the next chapter, where opportunistic bone traders peddle their grisly wares. In this city, even death is a commodity, and everyone from king to pauper has a stake. You slip through an iron gate, festooned with rusted chains, and emerge into a dusty courtyard where wheelbarrows groan under skeletal loads. Lantern light sketches long shadows across heaps of bone awaiting departure. You probably won't expect a bustling commerce here, but in 18th century Paris, bone traders thrived like any other merchant class. Only their wares were skulls and femurs instead of silk and spices. Historians still argue whether this grisly enterprise was a necessary reuse of resources, or a macabre exploitation of the dead. Ahead, a stocky figure in a leather apron hefts a wicker basket, brimming with shattered pelvis bones. He tips them into a trough where apprentices sort fragments by size, large pieces destined for fertilizer, smaller ones bound for anatomical schools. Fringe accounts claim some entrepreneurs even polished skulls smooth to double as chamber pots, though most buyers balked at a bone basin once they noticed the eye sockets. You wander closer, inhaling that distinctive chalky scent, the same calcium tang you encountered in Section 2's bone spiral, only amplified here by commerce. The trader, tipped hat dangling on a nail, beckons you forward. Interested in quality specimen, he asks, voice like gravel sliding down stone steps. Behind him, crates labelled Pour Jardin and Pour Cabinet stand ready. Garden distributors purchased crushed bone meal to enrich soil, while curious collectors snapped up whole skulls for private curiosity cabinets. Leaning on a stack of femurs, the trader explains that crushed bone was valued for its high phosphate content. Mainstream science of the day touted it as miracle manure for leggy cabbages and riotous rose bushes. It's said that King Louis XVI's own royal gardener imported tons of bone ash to coax early blooms for Versailles' famed parterres. Fringe horticulturists whispered that bones from aristocratic vaults yielded the sweetest lettuce, though such claims were more rumor than documented fact. As you examine a neat pile of tibia, you notice one bone bears a carved monogram, JL. A local sexton likely snatched it before mass crushing, hoping to sell it as a personalized keepsake. You run a finger over the carving, feeling the smooth ridge carved by a deft blade. Historians still argue whether these custom bone trinkets were a widespread fad or limited to fringe enthusiasts with morbid tastes. Nearby, a group of apprentices fashions decorative bone garlands, strings of polished phalanges interwoven with ribbons. They claim these memento mori necklaces remind wearers of life's transience, combining utility and moral instruction. In polite society, such jewelry was surprisingly fashionable among poets and philosophers. You recall Section 4's ambergris anecdote. Both garlands and exotic perfume served as status symbols. Only one required a willingness to don your own skeleton. Your lantern beam catches a pile of half-cleansed skulls glimmering dully in the dusk. These are headed for Paris's anatomy amphitheatres, where medical students begged cadavers and often bribed bone traders for fresh specimens. Fringe memoirs described secret after-hours bone sales, with urgent knocks at back-alley doors and whispered passwords. L'écran du minuit, the skull of midnight. Whether fact or fiction, these stories fueled student lore for decades. You avert your gaze from a cart piled high with vertebrae bound for a tannery, where bones were boiled for gelatin used in candle making and bookbinding. One trader proudly shows you a bone liquor extraction pot, boiling femurs overnight to produce glue so strong it rivaled animal hides. A perfunctory sniff confirms its industrial potency rather than domestic charm. Historians still argue whether Paris's booming leatherwork in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine depended heavily on bone-derived adhesives, or if alternative animal products dominated. A raucous laugh draws your attention to a cluster of men sampling bone dust mixed with gunpowder, a crude demonstration of osteofuel for hunting flintlock priming. They argue it makes for finer sparks and less smoke, though most hunters stuck with traditional black powder. Fringe technologists touted bone-based primers as the future of firearm ignition, but supply issues halted any serious adoption. Amid the clamour, a sleek carriage rolls in, dark, lacquered wood, brass studs gleaming under lanterns. Its passengers alight, a noble duchess and her companion, both draped in velvet cloaks. They inspect the wares through lace-gloved fingers, selecting a pair of matching skulls tied with silk bows. Rumour holds they'll flank the fireplace in her Paris townhouse, a conversation piece for salon gatherings. You sense that even amid scandal over queer fashion, nothing shocked Paris quite like civilizing your parlour with decapitated royalty. You pocket a polished canine tooth, small enough to pass as a grand souvenir, before turning back to the piles marked poide brut and poide net. Scale balances weigh each basket, traders arguing fractions of a pound for larger buyers. A scrawny clerk tallies sales in a ledger, noting destinations across France and as far away as Amsterdam. Bone exports constituted a modest but steady stream of revenue in pre-revolutionary trade ledgers. Fringe economists speculated that this trade softened fiscal woes of local parishes as burial fees faltered. Nearby, an elderly widow crouches beside a cart labelled Échantillon gratuits, free samples. She brushes off a skull fragment and murmurs a brief prayer before pocketing a shard for her small herb garden. She believes that planting basil over a bone shard yields herbs with extra aromatic potency, a home remedy passed down in her family. Historians still argue whether such folk practices influenced later horticultural manuals or died out with peasant customs. As you prepare to leave, the trader thrusts a business card carved into a thin strip of bone. Guillaume Lavigne, Ossuaire, Mitengrais. His name and services etched in elegant script. You tuck it into your coat, marveling at the absurd normalcy of corporate branding in a bone dust environment. It's a perfect emblem of Paris's pragmatic ingenuity, turned slightly querulous under the glow of lantern light. You step onto the street beyond the gate, bone dust clinging to your boots like an unwelcome souvenir. The air here feels palpably lighter, freed from the weight of heaps waiting sale. Yet you carry the memory of rattling baskets, shouted haggles, and the peculiar sense that wherever commerce thrives, it will soon find a way to repurpose even the dead. Your lantern guides you toward the next scene. Rumors of plague spreading panic among the living. Yet you pause to flick a stray femur crumb from your cuff. Paris's bone traders have done their work, turning mortality into merchandise, leaving you to ponder the strange alchemy that transforms death into profit. You slip down a lantern-lit alley toward the Place de la Bastille, but instead of cannon smoke and revolution, what greets you is a hush of panic, whispers riding the cobblestones like unseen couriers. You probably won't notice the first cough, a dry rattle carried on the night breeze, but soon it accumulates into a chorus, vulnerable labourers leaning against lampposts, clutching neckerchiefs to their faces, all wary of invisible contagion. Rumours swirl that plague has returned to the city, its spectre invited by the cemetery's fumes. At the corner of Rue Saint-Antoine, a hastily scribbled notice proclaims, "Suspicious fevers, report immediately." Lanterns hover over small groups where anxious citizens fumble for coins to bribe quartermasters. Fringe gossip claims some victims were merely overindulged in last night's chestnut wine. But grief and fear don't distinguish between hangover and infection. Historians still argue whether these early panic waves stemmed from actual outbreaks or from collective imagination fueled by miasma dread. You approach a gathered cluster of apothecaries and midwives, their tables groaning under glass jars filled with aromatic herbs. One midwife, her hands red from tincture stains, brusquely tosses lavender and wormwood into a simmering cauldron. "Here," she says, pressing a steaming rag into your hand. "Breathe this if you won't the plague's embrace." You inhale. Woody wormwood, tarragon tang, and a faint whisper of vinegar. It stings your eyes, but leaves your throat oddly soothed. Nearby, a scrivener from the Hotel Dieu fever ward scrawls names in a ledger by candlelight. Beside him, a young apprentice counts out vials of laudanum, the prized pain reliever distilled from opium poppies. Without it, the apprentice mutters, we'd hear only shrieks before the cough kills you. Mainstream records note that laudanum was a double-edged sword, easing suffering, but sowing dependence. Fringe critics deplored it as popish poison, claiming only true faith could cure fever's flame. A ragged man staggers away from the crowd, leaning on a baker's cart. His face glows pale in lantern light. His breath comes in wheezing sobs. A compassionate passerby offers him a spoonful of diluted vinegar and honey posca with a twist, while murmuring, "Drink, friend, and fear the fever less." Historians still argue whether such home remedies offered any measurable benefit, or simply comforted the afflicted in their final hours. You sidestep a group of city guards, muskets slung and batons at the ready. They enforce an unspoken curfew. No crowds, no idle chatter, and certainly no unauthorized burials. One guard jolts upright as you pass, examining your lantern and jacket for marks of infection. He tips his helmet in a perfunctory salute, part ritual, part reassurance that order still holds. Fringe tales tell of guards marking infected doors with red chalk, but rumors swirl that bribes often erased those warnings by sunrise. Above the square's fountain, the statue of Hercules seems to glare down at the unrest. Once a source of civic pride, today its marble facades feel like a silent rebuke. Strength in stone, but what of the city's mortal flesh? You drop a coin into the fountain, an offering for the gods of health, and wish silently for a breeze to clear this murk of dread. At a makeshift stall, an herbalist arrays her wares, crushed nettles, powdered horseradish, and something called dragonwort, a fringe ape's choice said to ward off evil seeds. You finger a small packet of dragonwort, earthy musk with a hint of bitterness, and wonder if anyone's tested it against real infection, or if it's merely a tale sold to the fearful. The herbalist assures you it's best for strengthening the lungs, though she can't say by how much. Further on, a priest in threadbare robes moves among the sick, offering quick prayers and sprinkling holy water from a pewter basin. His voice quavers as he chants, and you sense he's more frightened than his flock. He pauses beside an ailing woman clutching a tattered child. "May God spare your breath," he whispers, pressing the cross to her brow. You recall Section 9's tally of burial fees. No one dares ask who pays when death visits so broadly. Nearby, a group of young surgeons in starched white collars debate the origin of the crisis. One, eyes bright with grim fascination, argues from contagion theory. The fever leaps by touch, one clasped hand, one shared cup. Another retorts with miasma logic. No, it arises where the air stands still, in cellars and charnel pits. They wave surgical scissors as punctuation, half anxious to dissect a corpse for proof. Historians still argue whether these heated debates eased future medical advances or simply muddled treatments further. You edge closer to overhear their plan. "We'll prescribe fumigation," says one lively apprentice. "They'll burn brimstone, pitch, even old leather in communal courtyards. Anything to purify the air." Fringe proposals call for burning entire charnel sections every fortnight. But logistics and cost hem in such zeal. You recall Section 7's lime powder and Section 8's herbal sachets. This city experiments with every potion and powder under moonlight. A sudden cough pierces the assembly, a raw, rattling warning. But death's drumbeat grows louder. The surgeons snap to attention, leaning over the prone form of a mason's apprentice, slumped against a wall. His eyes flutter, he gasps. Water, cold. Ignoring miasma versus contagion, they lift him to a straw mattress and secure a tin cup of cold broth laced with a drop of laudanum. It's their best hope until dawn, when fresh doctors arrive with colder hands and sterner gazes. You step back, heart heavy, lantern light skating over flickering shadows. Above, church bells toll unevenly, marking hour and exhumation schedule alike. A distant bell from Les Innocents seems to toll in defiance. One more reminder that the dead's presence is unshakable, even as the living scramble for remedies. In the hush that follows, you sense a fragile truce. Priests extending prayers, surgeons furiously diagnosing, herbalists packaging hope in tiny sacks. All hands grasp at meaning amid chaos. You inhale the mingled scents, vinegar sting, herbal musk, laudanum's sweet ache, and appreciate the city's layered conviction that some solution, no matter how odd, might slay this silent interloper. You linger at the square's edge, recalling the bone traders of Section 10 repurposing death for profit. And now here, death repurposing the living for experiments. Is Paris a lab for catastrophe and invention alike? You shiver, despite the humid air, and tuck your coat tighter. The square's lanterns flicker like approaching storms, and you realize that the rumor of plague, whether true or imagined, has reshaped every corner of nightly life. Stepping away from the fevered crowd, you carry a scrap of the scrivener's ledger, where he jotted a single line: June 14, 1783, 10 new cases, pray for us. You fold it neatly and tuck it into your pocket, an artifact of panic and perseverance. Lantern in hand, you slip down a silent lane toward brighter lights, determined to witness how Paris balances dread with determination. Ahead lies the deluge of rain that bursts graves in Section 12. But for now, you savor this fleeting moment of shared fear and human compassion under the city's skeletal gaze. You step out of the fevered square into a street slick with early summer rain, each cobblestone reflecting lantern light, like scattered gems. The downpour began just before dawn, and now water cascades from slate roofs in silver sheets that drench your cloak. You probably won't notice the first trickle creeping beneath cellar doors, but soon you'll feel the tremor of something unsettling. The buried dead stirring beneath the soaked earth. As the rain intensifies, gutter channels overflow, sending rivulets of brackish water down mansion stoops and common thresholds alike. By mid-18th century accounts, Paris endured occasional great floods, when the Seine swelled and sent groundwater surging through ancient burial grounds. Historians still argue whether these inundations stemmed more from seasonal thaw or ill-maintained sewers, though parish records lament every flood as an act of divine mischief. You trudge onward, your boots splashing through a shallow stream that's pooled over a grated vent into a basement below. Through a grimy window you catch a flicker of candlelight in a grocer's storeroom, then recoil as something brownish-grey seeps upward, a sickly slurry of dissolved bone fragments and clinging shroud fibres. Fringe lore claimed that after the deluge of 1778, some households discovered coffin tops bobbing like forlorn rafts, as though the dead themselves were trying to escape Paris's damp embrace. You lean down, pressing your palm against the window's cold glass. Within, soggy sacks of potatoes float next to stacked barrels of pickled onions, and every crate drips a slurry of earth and decay. A shopkeeper inside stares at you in horror, thrusting a lantern toward the ceiling, revealing rivulets tracing the plaster's cracks. He seals the door with a battered sign, Bien à l'abri, mais pas de squelettes. Safe inside, but no skeletons, and laughs nervously, as if that might keep the dead at bay. A sudden crash makes you jump. A loose board snaps under the weight of water, sending a small cascade gushing onto the street. That sound, loom, resembles the toppling of stacked skulls in a hidden vault. You shiver, recalling Section 2's bone spiral and Section 5's creaking charnel walls. Now, Earth itself groans under this unexpected baptism, and you can almost hear the bones rattling below like a restless choir. Navigating past a tipped barrel, releasing beet juice into the flood, you remember that municipal employees once attempted to line shallow graves with stone slabs to prevent water intrusion. The effort failed spectacularly, as the slabs cracked under hydraulic pressure, and the resulting cracks funneled more fluid into the remains. Historians still argue whether these slab-lining experiments marked a sincere engineering effort, or a half-hearted gesture paid for by wealthy patrons seeking PR glory. You follow the rainwater's path toward a low-lying row of tenements built atop an old parish vault. Lantern beams caught through iron bars reveal a grim tableau. A cellar floor mottled with floating fragments of cloth, small bone chips, and what looked like decayed flower wreaths once left on coffins. The air pressed against your face carries the faint but unmistakable scent of phosphorescent bone, chalky and damp, like a miner's cave after a storm. Suddenly a window cracks open, and a woman's voice hisses, "Get away from there." She brandishes a broom, trying to sweep the muck back inside. You stifle a laugh at her methods, hardly effective, but admire her spirit. Desperate times, after all, call for desperate broom-wielding. Fringe newspapers of the day quipped that Paris's finest weapon against angry cemeteries was a broomstick, though few chroniclers described its success rate. Pressing onward, you duck under a dripping canopy and recall Section 7's midnight burials. Now entirely buried by rain-flattened earth, you peer into an open manhole where the water flow seems unnaturally turbid. Liquefied earth, shattered brick, and fragments of bone swirl together in an unholy whirlpool. A drunk cart driver leans over, shouting, "The sewers eat the dead tonight." He staggers backward, disappears into the gloom, and you wonder if he means it literally. You trudge toward the Seine's banks, where floodwaters lap at the quays. Lanterns positioned for nighttime promenades now stand half-submerged, their iron posts pitted with rust. Beneath the shallow waves you spy dark shapes drifting under the water. Pieces of coffin planks, maybe even a skull or two bobbing like lost driftwood. A passing barge, its hull painted with fish motifs, rocks gently as cartographers plot new maps to avoid submerged hazards. A fringe rumour tells of the night of the floating staunch, where an entire hastily dug trench beside Saint-Jean-en-Grève overflowed, sending the interred tumbling into the frozen Seine, their bodies carried downriver for days. The tale's veracity is debated. Some say it's a dramatic embellishment of a modest flood. Others insist 2,000 corpses drifted past suburban mills. Historians still argue whether eyewitness accounts of that night deserve credence or were hallucinations born of terror. You skirt the riverbank. The currents hiss a constant undertone to your footsteps. You consider whether this was nature's way of forcing the city to confront its buried dead, an involuntary exhumation so dramatic that no decree could ignore it. In Section 6, royal edicts failed to stop burials. Here, rainwater might succeed where kings and priests did not. Ahead lies a small impromptu relief station, where parish workers distribute straw mats and wooden planks to raise furniture above the flood line. A grizzled old engineer cavorts under a dripping canopy, instructing volunteers to ram sandbags into window wells. He mutters half in jest, "If you can ford a basement full of skulls, you can conquer any deluge." You grin at his bravado, but can't help picturing those basements likely once jam-packed with human bones. The young parish clerk approaches, parchment in hand, detailing orders to cordon off streets most prone to seepage. He explains that they plan to dig pilot holes to channel water into new trench drains, though those won't be ready until next season. You sympathize with the delay. Trench drains take time, and wet corpses wait for no man. Rain intensifies again, and you lift your cloak hood, water streaming off your shoulders. You grab hold of a hitching post to avoid slipping, and your lantern tilts wildly, its beam cutting a narrow path through the downpour. You almost slip again when a shoal of debris surges from a grate, fragments of coffin nails, bits of lace, and what might be a child's wooden cross mingled with the current. The scene strikes you as both horrifying and poetic. A city's forgotten souls forced into one final journey toward the river's mouth. You press on, heart pounding, aware that the flood is temporary but its memory may not be. As you round the corner toward dry ground, you catch a drift of fresh air from the gardens of the Hotel d'Invalada and mint carried on a high breeze. That contrast feels like salvation, a breath of terrestrial life after the city's submerged underworld. You glance back at the inundated street, listening to the hiss of water and the creak of cellar doors straining under hydrostatic pressure. In that moment you understand why reformers finally pressed for cemetery closure and the great relocation to the quarries beneath the city. No royal edict or moral plea matched the authority of water invading private homes. With your feet finally on higher ground, you shake off droplets and smooth your cloak. You tuck the clerk's parchment detailing future drain works into your pocket, a promise of engineering over superstition, and you carry with you the echo of slurry-filled basements, the fleeting ghost lights of submerged coffins, and the knowledge that sometimes Paris's buried dead make themselves known in the most dramatic way possible. You step onto a mist-shrouded boulevard where the hush feels pregnant with purpose. Paris has finally decided to unearth its buried past. Lanterns cast pale pools of light on damp limestone facades, and you trudge beneath banners announcing the royal decree by Edict of Mesdames de France. All city churchyards will be emptied, and their bones transferred to abandoned quarries deep below. You probably won't detect the first tremors of change, but soon you'll sense the city's bones stirring, ready for their second act. Historians still argue whether this decision stemmed from genuine public health concerns, or was simply a prestige project to showcase enlightened monarchy. Ahead, you pass a cart, emblazoned with the royal crest, piled high with iron chains and lanterns, the equipment for the grand excavation. Workers in heavy wool coats shout orders as teams gather at each exhumation site. The rattle of axes striking coffin lids echoes like impatient heartbeats, and you feel a thrill after centuries of anonymous stacking. These bones will at last embark on a curated journey. Fringe accounts claim some gravediggers treated the decree like an early retirement package, giddy at the chance to swap shovels for lanterns and descend into moonlit caverns. You follow the procession toward the cemetery of Saint Martin des Champs, one of the first slated for clearance. A wooden archway bears an inscription, Intre des Eaux Seamen, and you duck beneath it, lantern in hand. Immediately the air shifts, cooler, drier, as if breathed through limestone lungs. You inhale deeply, and taste chalk dust, mingled with the faintest hint of damp earth. Beneath your feet, ground hinges on loose pebbles, remnants of ancient quarrying that once fed the city's building boom. Workers fling back the sod, revealing coffin after coffin in neat rows. The site recalls Section 7's midnight trenches, but here the operation is daylight spectacle. Officials in powdered wigs preside, quill in hand, as names are ticked off from parish ledgers. A fringe memoir describes locals gathering with picnics to watch, as though the exhumations were a carnival attraction. You smile at the idea of juggling human remains instead of flaming baton. A group of labourers heave a coffin onto a beer wagon. You lean close and catch the gleam of nails and decorative handles. This was no pauper's pine box. They slide back the lid, and the air rushes out with a whoosh, carrying the stale breath of decades. Beneath, a woman's skeleton lies curled as if asleep, her delicate collarbone still catching the lantern's glow. Mainstream records note that almost every coffin yielded personal artifacts: buttons, lockets, scraps of embroidered shroud, tangible echoes of lives once lived. You tuck a leather-bound keepsake into your pocket, a small scrap of ribbon, likely woven from a mourning handkerchief. It feels oddly precious, a human fingerprint in this sea of calcified echoes. As you rise, you remember Section 2's playful mouse bones, and wonder if any rodents lingered in these graves, surviving centuries in the dark. Fringe theories conjecture that a few hardy rats hitched rides on bone wagons, colonizing the subterranean tunnels, though no census has confirmed their presence. The procession moves on, lanterns bobbing in unison like fireflies crossing a cathedral nave. You follow to the quarry entrance, a yawning mouth carved into limestone cliffs. A gangplank spans the gap between street and pit, its wooden planks slick with moss. Below, you glimpse the cavern's rough-hewn walls pocked with ancient drill marks where masons once extracted stone. Now those walls await a different cargo, the remains of over 500,000 Parisians. You descend, the lantern's beam shrinking to a pinpoint. As you venture into the quarry's maw, each step echoes. Thud, echo, thud, reverberating off walls that once rang with hammer strikes. The air here is cool and bone-dry, a welcome relief from the cemetery's dank gloom. Yet there's an undercurrent of expectancy, a hush like the opening note of a symphony. You pause on a ledge, lantern raised, and marvel at a vaulted ceiling draped in stalactites. Fringe spelunkers swore these formations carried the spirits of the buried, dripping memories onto the quarry floor. Below, workers have begun constructing ossuary walls, neat rows of skulls framed by femurs, replicating the catacomb artistry that would soon define the site. You recall Section 5's charnel walls and Section 8's bone days. Here those motifs coalesce into grand design. A master mason oversees the process, marking out patterns with chalk, concentric circles, rosettes, even alignments that echo the constellations above. Historians still argue whether these designs were intended as sacred symbolism or merely decorative bravado. A gravedigger turned builder taps a skull into place, its empty eye sockets facing outward like silent sentinels. Perfect fit, he mutters, smoothing a ridge with his palm. You crouch beside him and trace the curvature, smooth with decades of handling, worn by countless fingers. In one hollow, you spot a tiny engraving, Melar 7x72. Perhaps the initials of a carpenter who added his own signature over 4 years before the transfer began. It's a whisper across time, a personal touch amid the monolithic mass of death. Higher on the ledge, you notice a cluster of quartz crystals wedged in a rock crevice, offerings left by laborers to sweeten the stones. Fringe superstition held that crystals absorbed negative energy, preventing restless spirits from wandering the tunnels. You pocket a small shard, clear as tears, and imagine it glowing faintly under torchlight in the centuries to come. You rise and follow a row of carts stacked with bones along a narrow track, the wheels screeching against iron rails embedded in limestone. The carts roll to a central shaft where teams lower baskets of skulls into deeper chambers. A pulley system creaks under the load, each basket's descent a staccato beat. Clang, creak, drop. It feels like a ritual, a funeral march in mechanical rhythm. Fringe chroniclers likened the pulleys to bones in a spine, flexing to support the city's reinvention of its underworld. On a ledge overlooking the pit, a royal inspector in velvet coat jots notes in a leather-bound journal. Site progress, estimate of bones transferred per day, and a margin note. By month's end, les innocents complete. You catch a glimpse of his ink-stained fingers, and for a moment you envy the power that pen wields, turning mortal remains into project milestones. Yet you can't help but feel gratitude. Without this grand relocation, the stink and risk would have persisted for decades more. You climb back toward daylight, senses tingling as fresh air spills over your head. A sentinel at the quarry mouth lifts his lantern, its glow a beacon guiding your ascent. You emerge into a courtyard where parishioners gather to watch straw mats replaced with new turf, the land reclaimed for greenery and promenades. A small band plays a cheerful tune, un pas de mort, un pas de danse they call it, celebrating each shaft emptied and each bone laid to rest anew. You inhale the night air, tinged with grass and moss where corpses once lay. Above, the moon glints off fresh lantern-lit rows of wheelbarrows, waiting for the next load. You recall Section 12's rain-burst graves and Section 6's ignored edicts, both yielded to this decisive act of engineering. Here, in this quarry, Paris hopes to bury its past in order to live more fully above. You pocket your crystals and ribbon scrap, tokens of personal narratives amid this grand public effort. Lantern in hand, you step onto the boulevard, footsteps echoing softly like a final heartbeat. Ahead lies Section 14's Labyrinth of Silence, where these bones will find new voices in the echoing catacombs. But for now, you stand on reclaimed turf, witnessing Paris's boldest excavation yet, the unearthing of an entire city's history, repurposed to protect the living. You follow the creak of iron gates into a hidden courtyard, where lanterns hang from stout chains like sentinels guiding solemn processions. The night air is cool, crisp enough to rouse goosebumps, but carries a whisper of damp stone, reminding you that this is no ordinary city street. You probably won't notice the first cargo wagon lumber past, but soon you'll hear the thud of wooden wheels and the hush of hushed curses as gravediggers load their bone-laden crates. Historians still argue whether the catacombs' creation was spurred more by hygienic necessity or by the spectacle of reclaiming public space. Ahead, a long line of low-slung wagons forms, each piled high with wicker baskets brimming with skulls and femurs. The baskets clatter as men shift their weight, and the lantern light flickers across ivory curves worn smooth by centuries of handling. You trudge alongside the procession, your footsteps echoing in time with the muted hoofbeats. A fringe account from a quarry labourer recalls that at first, drivers attempted to muffle the noise with straw bales to avoid waking ghosts, they joked. But the clamour proved unavoidable. You step close to a wagon's side and inhale the distinctive, chalky aroma, tinged with the faintest trace of vinegar from lime rinse. It's oddly antiseptic, like a dentist's office in the night. Beside you, a gravedigger offers you a lantern, its glass lens etched with the initials JB. You raise it, illuminating rows of skulls lined in the basket below, careful not to disturb their fragile balance. Mainstream records note that each basket carried roughly 50 skulls, carefully counted and registered against parish ledgers before departure. As you walk, you pass under a low stone archway carved into the earth, the portal to the labyrinth. Moss-flecked walls press in, and the ground slopes downward on ancient flagstones. You grip the wagon's edge for balance, heart thumping as the descent begins. Fringe spelunkers whispered that the tunnels themselves sometimes groaned, an effect of shifting earth or perhaps the restless stirrings of those whose bones now travelled below. The corridor narrows until only a single wagon can pass. Wheels scraping echoes off limestone walls, slick with condensation. Lantern glow reveals chalk marks, arrows and notations scrawled by quarry surveyors, mapping routes laid decades earlier. You trace a red arrow marking Hall of Monsters, though the name refers only to a narrow stretch where stalactites hang low, like dripping jaws. Historians still argue whether these tunnel nicknames were practical waypoints or the macabre fancy of bored labourers. You pause at a fork where two paths diverge, one leading toward the central ossuary, the other toward a side gallery for future transfers. A foreman in a leather jerkin consults a waxed parchment map, quill in hand. He murmurs, "We push onward to the catacombs, then loop back for the rest." You follow his lantern, stepping gingerly over a coiled rope where bones wait in stacked crates for the next journey. Above you, the ceiling lowers, and water drips in steady rhythm, plink plink into shallow puddles. Every drop echoes like a drumbeat, a metronome marking your progress. You lean in, listening to the liquid cadence, thinking of Section 5's creaking charnel walls and Section 12's rain floods. Here water no longer threatens to flood your path. It merely accompanies you, carving its slow path through rock. A wagon halts as it reaches a vaulted chamber. Here workers unload baskets, tilting them to spill skulls onto a stone platform. You step forward and watch the careful choreography. A labourer lifts each skull, brushing off residual debris, then slots it into a growing wall. Femurs follow, lining up like keys in a monumental pipe organ. Fringe artisans once claimed these arrangements followed occult geometries, aligning bone rosettes with underground ley lines, but no record confirms such mystical intent. You reach out to touch a skull's smooth dome, feeling the faint indent of a healed fracture, a quirky reminder that these weren't anonymous relics but real people who endured accidents or injuries. One skull bears a tiny engraving of a crowned heart, perhaps marking a noble or simply the whim of a sexton with a sharp blade. Historians still argue whether such personalization was widespread or confined to a few eccentric cases. A soft chant drifts through the chamber, workmen lending voice to their labor, humming a ballad about Paris in spring. It's a tender soundtrack, incongruous amid white bones, yet deeply human. You imagine centuries later, visitors in furs and bonnets will hear the echo and wonder if it's truly memory or merely the cavern's resonance. Looming overhead is the chamber's keystone, a vast arch where a master mason has arranged skulls and bones into a stylized macabre crest. You recall Section 13's concentric quarry patterns here. Those motifs reappear, but made from human remains. Two massive ribs curve outward like wings, framing a central skull crowned with femur spines. Beneath, a Latin inscription scraped into plaster reads, "Pour que la vie reste en paix," so that the living may find peace. You step back as workers secure the design with a scant cement wash, locking bones in place. A foreman nods in approval, and the crowd of labourers breaks into quiet applause, an odd celebration for a macabre mural. You catch a glimpse of a young apprentice wiping a tear, moved by the solemn beauty. It reminds you of Section 2's moss-carved skulls and Section 4's ribboned zygomatic arches. Paris has long flirted with the line between reverence and spectacle. A lantern-bearer guides you onward down a narrow ledge, hewn just wide enough for one wagon. Ahead, a dim light spills from an opening, the main artery of the catacombs. You step through and find yourself in a vast hall where bone walls stretch into shadowy distance. Lanterns suspended from iron hooks create pools of gold on walls of white bone. You can feel the hush here, a weightless silence broken only by distant dripping and the muted scuff of boots on stone. Amidst it all, you experience a curious calm, a momentary transcendence where death's trappings become silent guardians. The procession pauses, and you realize this subterranean cathedral will soon house the remains of Les Innocents and other churchyards. It will be a labyrinth of silence, a hidden city beneath Paris, open only to those who know its paths. You take a breath, lantern in hand, and step forward into the echoing expanse. Each footprint sparks a small cloud of powdery dust, settling like snow on bone. Ahead lies the true heart of the catacombs, where rows upon rows of skulls fronting stacked femurs will greet silent pilgrims. As you walk, you imagine centuries of footsteps behind you, labourers, revolutionaries, poets, all drawn into this hollow world by curiosity or necessity. You glance back once, catching the steady line of bone-laden wagons threading through carved corridors. A final basket of skulls tilts, and a smooth orb falls free, rolling at your feet. You nudge it gently, and it settles with a soft click, as if urging you onward. You lift the skull to eye level. It bears a small tooth-shaped chip, a reminder of fragility. You place it on the platform, aligning it with its fellows, and step away. The procession gathers, men adjusting lanterns, voices hushed in reverence. You lift your lantern high, its glow a beacon pointing the way deeper into the bone halls. A soft murmur rises, a collective prayer that the living may learn from the dead. Historians still argue whether the catacombs' ultimate purpose was solemn memorial or morbid spectacle, but in this hushed moment, you sense it is both. You turn your gaze to the yawning corridor ahead, bones stretching like tiers of seats in a silent amphitheatre. Somewhere beyond, the final baskets from Les Innocents descend like inverted chandeliers. You take one last look at the bone crest above you, its femur wings offering a strange promise. Here, death is organized, ordered, and contained. And here, perhaps, you find the comfort of structure amid life's chaos. You lift your lantern once more and step forward, lantern light dancing across the labyrinth's endless corridors. Heart steady as rock, you emerge into early morning light on the Rue de la Boule Rouge, where dew-damp cobbles glint like scattered gems, and the scent of fresh grass intermingles with warm bread baking at dawn. The city, once choked by cemeteries and charnel walls, now breathes anew. You probably won't notice it on your first inhale. Your lungs still remember bone dust tang, but gradually the air feels lighter, perfumed by flower stalls setting up shop and the distant hiss of coffee steam. Paris is trading its funeral pall for lively aromas, rose petals, roasting chestnuts, and the faintest whisper of horse manure. Now a farming resource rather than a running joke about urban hygiene. You walk past a newly turfed square where children chase pigeons across soft emerald turf. Only months ago, this spot was part of the old St. Innocents churchyard, layered with centuries of bodies. Today it's a promenade of manicured lawns and wrought iron benches. Historians still argue whether municipal landscapers prioritized aesthetics over public health when designing these green cemeteries, but locals agree. It's infinitely more pleasant than ducking bone shards in summer floods. At a corner flower stall, you pause to admire bouquets of lavender, rosemary and hyacinth choices as much practical as pretty. Town planners planted aromatic herbs along former burial perimeters, believing that a sprig of rosemary not only honored the dead, but also kept residual grim vapors at bay. Fringe gardeners claimed lavender hedges would ward off lingering spirits, though nobody quite knows whether it checked ghosts or just looked charming against limestone facades. You tuck a sprig into your lapel, both for fragrance and the hope of a calming whisper when walking past shadowed lanes later. A vendor sells piping hot croissants, the buttery layers flaking under your touch. You bite in, and the warm flake melts on your tongue, a comforting contrast to the chewy bone crisp you sampled in section 2. A passing customer coughs, sending a puff of powdered sugar into the air like tiny snowflakes. You remember the bone dust that once swirled through these streets, and you laugh at the replacement. Sugar, not skull fragments, dusting sidewalk tables. Across the way, a marble fountain gurgles, newly restored, its basin shimmers with fresh water, no longer muddied by slurry from broken graves, and pedal boats now drift lazily on its surface. In place of truncated headstones, carved cherubs spout ornamental water jets, celebrating life rather than memorializing death. Locals joke that the cherubs are heaven's water sprites, though fountain engineers quietly note that improved drainage and sealed conduits did more to keep the liquefied remains underground than any divine intervention. You continue past a public notice board where a hand-lettered proclamation invites residents to plant trees for tomorrow. Each sapling is dedicated to a parish whose former cemetery was cleared, in effect, a living memorial for forgotten souls. You pause at the entry for Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie, where a young apprentice has scrawled beneath it, "May my willow weep with them." Historians still argue whether these arboreal commemorations stemmed from sincere grief or served as green PR for property developers. Either way, the sapling's fragile leaves tremble in the breeze, whispering both loss and renewal. A soldier in midnight blue uniform drills nearby, his boots echoing a crisp cadence across the square. He's part of the new municipal ossuary guard, tasked with overseeing the transfer of bones to the catacombs and ensuring no curious loiterers disturb the process. Rueful rumor says they once giggled at shadows in the tunnels, mistaking echoes for specters, though supervisors officially dismiss such tales as indiscipline. You salute the guard, and he tips his shako with a grin, appreciating your recognition of a job that pairs ceremonial dignity with subterranean labor. Further on, the church of Saint-Étienne-du-Mont stands freshly whitewashed, its graveyard gates removed and replaced with a low hedge. Parishioners now gather on stone steps to attend morning mass, in the open air, singing hymns that echo across former burial plots. A local choir director once lamented that the removed headstones robbed the church of its solemn whisper, but now concedes that congregants appreciate the sun on their faces rather than the chill of crypt walls. Fringe liturgists still argue whether outdoor services honor or desecrate modern sanctity, but you decide you'd prefer the breeze over dank catacombs any Sunday. You pause at a small cafe terrace outside where tables cluster beneath canvas awnings. Patrons sip chocolat chaud and nibble brioche fingers, casting casual glances at the neat rows of limewash-coated houses beyond. That row once bordered Saint-Jean-en-Grève Cemetery, and you recall the sight of coffin tops bobbing in floodwaters, section 12. Now, you'd never guess that water once carried bone chips to basement drains. You smile at the thought. Progress isn't a rope or an edict, it's the comfort of a warm drink. A pair of well-dressed scholars stroll by, poring over a pamphlet titled Traité sur les nouvelles sépultures. They debate in clipped tones. Do ground-level ossuary walls understate the gravity of death, or do they integrate it seamlessly into daily life? Historians still argue whether the new cemetery designs garden plots on the periphery of the city truly resolved the old problems, or simply shifted them beyond the gates. Fringe planners propose floating cemeteries on barges along the Seine, though practical considerations have kept that idea afloat, only in rumor. You wander into a children's playground where laughter echoes between swings and slides. A low stone wall, once the boundary of a parish burial ground, now sports a mosaic mural depicting skeletons dancing in jovial marionette poses. The artist's signature reads, R. 7084, perhaps the same Marguerite Leroy who crafted Section 5's bone dace. You imagine her chuckling at the irony. Skeletons once confined to pits, now flouncing in bright tile, teaching children that death can inspire art and play. Beyond the playground, a leafy boulevard unfolds, flanked by rows of plane trees planted to commemorate parishes emptied of graves. Lanterns strung between branches cast warm light at dusk, turning the avenue into a gentle corridor of living memory. You pause beneath one plane, tucking your rosemary sprig into a knot in your cloak. The tree's bark peels in papery ribbons, reminding you that even solid structures shed the old to reveal new layers beneath. A carriage clip-clops past and you note its coachman's steady rhythm, a symbol of a city returning to normal life. No more midnight burial runs or bone-laden wagons rattling through tunnels. Instead, the streets pulse with commerce, curiosity and the gentle cadence of daily routine. You lean against a lamppost once the boundary marker between living quarters and churchyard and exhale, savouring the moment. In the distance, the entrance to the catacombs yawns, silent and hidden beneath unassuming facades. You recall the hush of Section 14's Labyrinth, and wonder if any of today's strollers imagine the subterranean city teeming beneath their feet. Probably not. Paris has mastered the art of cloaking its underworld, yet a part of you thrills at the thought that below ground, the bones line up in solemn vigil, reminding the living of their finite breath. You pocket a fallen plane tree seed, a potential sapling for future arbor memorials. Its smooth shell feels buoyant in your palm, an emblem of continuity from flesh to bone to dust to sapling. Life asserts itself anew. You smile at the chain of transformations, each phase both an end and a beginning. As you stroll on, cafes fill with chatter, church bells ring for midday, and the city's fragrance coalesces into a warm perfume of bread, flowers, and topsoil. The vanished graveyards are now footnotes beneath fancy lawns and park benches, but their memory lingers in each stone arch and whispering plane tree. In reclaiming its living spaces, Paris has also reclaimed its spirit, proving that even the weight of death can be lightened by the fertile breath of life. You step off the brightly lit boulevard and descend a narrow stair, carved into the pavement, each step echoing your heartbeat as you slip back into the hush of Paris's hidden ossuary. Lantern in hand, you feel the temperature drop, the air growing cool and dry like a wine cellar. You probably won't notice at first, but this is the point where the city's living pulse and its silent underworld converge. Above, laughter and horses. Below, millions of bones arranged in solemn order. Historians still argue whether the catacombs were meant as a utilitarian solution, or a grand mausoleum of collective memory. Ahead, a low archway bears a faded inscription. Arrête. C'est ici l'Empire de la Mort. Stop. Here is the Empire of the Dead. You duck beneath it, and enter a vaulted gallery, where skulls line the walls in grids of ivory stare. Rows of femurs frame each panel, creating endless corridors that seem to stretch into infinity. Candlelight dances on bone, casting ghostly patterns across the limestone vaulted ceiling. In this chamber, even sound feels muffled, as if the dead absorb echoes to keep their kingdom undisturbed. You trudge onward, guided by the gentle drip of water from unseen fissures. Wet stalactites glitter overhead, a callback to Section 5's creaking charnel walls and Section 12's flood-rippled basements here. Water has carved a softer hymn into stone. A single skull rests on a low ledge, its jawbone missing a tooth. Fringe lore claims that missing teeth were sometimes pilfered by daring spelunkers seeking macabre souvenirs, though no historian's ledger confirms the theft tally. A sliver of daylight peeks through a grate high above, a reminder that the living world still breathes just yards away. You pause, lantern raised, and feel the contrast, sunlight's warm promise above, perpetual twilight below. You recall Section 15's green promenade and freshly planted plane trees, life unfolding anew while here the past's final witnesses remain. As you follow the corridor's gentle curve, you spot a niche where a single bone pillar spirals upward, an unexpected flourish amid rigid grids. A small plaque identifies it as the Pillar of René, named for a quarry mason who died in 1792, and was interred here with a few personal touches, a curated spiral instead of a standard stack. Mainstream records note that a handful of labourers requested such bespoke arrangements, though decades later most of these anomalies were standardized into the general bone matrix. Historians still argue whether these individual tributes were acts of piety or early signs of pietistic tourism. You move deeper, the air tasting faintly of chalk and old incense, probably from Section 9's Clergy versus Crown skirmishes over holy burial rites. Here, tattered scraps of pewter and leather occasionally glint among the bones, remnants of rosary cases. belt buckles, and buttons that slipped from shrouds during exhumation. You pocket a tiny metal bead, its grooves worn smooth, which may have once threaded a prayer into the hand of a grieving widow. A hush falls as you enter the Hall of the Apricot Trees, so named for carved apricot blossoms etched into the limestone walls by Revolution-era prisoners. Quartered here in the contrast between spring flower motifs and human remains is eerie. Delicate carvings that once promised renewal now arch over silent witnesses to mortality. Fringe historians speculate that these carvings served as secret revolutionary messages, though no cipher has ever been definitively cracked. You press on until the corridor opens into the grand gallery, where bone walls stand 20 feet high, and the ceiling vaults overhead like a ribcage. Lanterns hang at regular intervals, their glow warm against the stark white of skulls that gleam like pearls. You trudge down the center aisle, each footstep whisper-soft on smooth flagstones. A gentle hush permeates the space, so profound you can almost hear your own thoughts echo in the hush. At the far end, a cluster of skulls forms a grand heart shape, a modern addition from 1837, when ornamental catacomb tours began under city supervision. Visitors pressed coins into the heart's recesses as offerings, a gesture both whimsical and reverent. You recall Section 8's debates between doctors and apothecaries here. Faith and curiosity intertwine in gesture rather than argument. You approach the heart and kneel, running a fingertip along the cool bone. In that moment, you feel the weight of every life counted here. Carpenters, seamstresses, children, nobles, and paupers alike. The catacombs hold nearly 6 million Parisians, about half the city's current population, stacked in silent communion. That staggering number alone curls the spine, yet you feel a serene respect rather than horror. Rising, you turn toward the exit corridor, a gentle upward slope leading back to daylight. As you ascend, the lantern's glow dims, and the walls transition from bone back to raw quarry stone. You pass a small alcove where tour guides now display lanterns and informational placards. Another callback to Section 14's ceremonial installations. 3 cheerful tourists pause for a photograph, their camera flashes briefly illuminating rows of skulls before fading into the dark. You smile at their wonder. This place has always balanced solemnity with spectacle. You step through the final arch, emerging onto Rue des Saussayes as dawn's first rays gild the cobblestones. The city yawns awake, bakery ovens fire up, carriage bells jingle, and street vendors arrange their wares. You pause amidst the morning bustle, lantern under arm, before tucking it away, a relic of your subterranean pilgrimage. You inhale the fresh air deeply, tasting the sweet promise of sunrise and the gentle warmth of human life. Above you, the streets hum with possibility, unburdened by the weight of centuries. Yet beneath your feet lies a hidden city of bones, a testament to Paris's audacious dance with death and life. Wind down, the city's heartbeat returns in gentle rhythms. The clip-clop of hooves, the distant murmur of morning prayers, and the soft murmur of coffee steam rising from cafe terraces. You breathe in the dawn's glow, each inhale a reminder that life, in all its vibrant imperfection, endures. Even as you carry echoes of cool bone walls and candlelit corridors, your mind settles into a tranquil accord. Below street level, 6 million stories rest in curated order, their silent vigil a constant beacon guiding the living toward humility and wonder. Up here, the world unfolds in golden light. Flowers sway in tender breezes, pigeons coo atop fountains, and children's laughter winds through narrow lanes. The contrast feels sacred, as though Paris has woven life and death into a single tapestry, each thread essential to the narrative. Let your thoughts drift like the phantom echoes you heard beneath the catacombs, murmurs of tolling bells, the rustle of silk shrouds, and the soft scrape of quarry picks against limestone. Embrace the gentle music of the city waking, the call of street musicians tuning violins, the lullaby hum of distant church bells, and the hush between footsteps that allows your soul to rest. You've navigated the city's hidden arteries, touched ivory relics of the past, and emerged renewed by the living world's promise. Now, sink into sleep with the knowledge that Paris's underworld is at peace, its bones arranged in quiet order, and its lights guiding you back to warmth. Tomorrow, carry this calm with you. Let the catacombs' hush remind you that even after darkness, dawn unfailingly arrives. End of script. Sweet dreams.